Well, hello, my beautiful reader friends, and welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you are new here. My name is Lori Beth, and welcome to my little corner of the internet where I get into all of the bookish small talk. So here we are, still in the dead of winter, but with one more holiday upon us, and that would be Valentine's Day. Now, I know that this holiday goes either way for people. Some people really love it, and some people prefer not to even acknowledge it. And I can see it from both sides. I will say that. So of course, it is very common to do a book recommendation video when a holiday is upon us, but what I wanted to do in today's video was some unconventional book recommendations for Valentine's Day, if you will. Maybe even some unhinged recommendations. Because if there is one thing that you can say for sure about love, it comes in many different forms, including, but not limited to, unhinged, toxic, and really just unhealthy at times. And that's what I wanted to give you in today's book recommendations video. Some books that are going to talk about either toxic love or really just kind of dumpster fire love. Because yes, even though I love love, I don't always want warm and cozy and something wrapped up in a pretty little bow. I want the drama behind a story. And speaking of love, I would like to take a minute to thank the partner of today's video, which is Novelwicks candles. You guys know how much I love Novelwicks at this point in time, but I am so excited because I just recently got my Valentine's Day package from Novelwicks, which included two of the most beautiful love hypothesis themed candles, and oh my gosh, they are stunning. The scents are absolutely to die for, not to mention the beautiful colors and the wood wick burning candles that just make the most pleasant sound as they are burning in the background of your room. At this point in time, I basically have candles stacked throughout every room of my house, and if you would like to be on that level, you can use my code Lori10 to get a discount on anything that she has for sale in the shop. She also releases candles on a weekly basis every Thursday, and you can check my Instagram and her Instagram for some sneak peeks about what those releases are going to be. Check out that website linked down below, and once you pick out a candle for yourself, come on back to this video and let me know which one that you chose. So by now, I'm sure you all know the drill. We do have quite a few books to go over, so we are going to jump right in. And I think we are going to do today's video by genre, and we are going to start with our very first genre, which is fantasy. And the very first book on our list is Belladonna by Adeline Grace. And I've talked about this book so many times, but I just can't help it. When I thought about toxic love, this was one of the first things that came to mind, because if you don't know anything about this story, we follow a main character named Signa who is like touched by death, or she is able to kind of see or hear ghosts and dead people, and she does so by poisoning herself with belladonna berries so she can kind of cross to the other side. As she starts doing this more and more, she develops a relationship with death himself, and so ensues the most delicious, gothic, slow burn, shadow daddy romance I think I have ever read. Not only do I love this book, I love this entire series. So if you like kind of a gothic, earthy gothic vibe, mixed with like Bridgerton, oh, absolutely unmatched vibes in this book. And from there, we have our next book, which is The Cruel Prince by Miss Holly Black. And I don't think I've talked about this book honestly that much on my channel before, which is like funny because I've talked about Belladonna so much, but the love I have for this entire world, I can't, we probably don't have time to go into it. In fact, we don't have time to go into it. I know that for sure. But if you don't know anything about this story, we follow a girl named Jude who has been kind of like adopted into the fairy realm. She is a human and she grows up in this world of fairies. And if you don't know anything about Holly Black's writing, she does not write the typical romantasy fairy that we're used to seeing. These guys are not like 6'3" with like really big wingspans and covered in tattoos. No, these are mean as hell fairies. And she basically gets treated like garbage as she is growing up in this fairy realm. So the basis of this story is her having this enemies to lovers romance with Carden, who is the cruel prince in this world. And he is definitely cruel. Actually, in the beginning of the book, it's a little hard to read. He's very, very mean to her, but it makes for such a good enemies to lovers romance, like truly enemies to lovers. And you get a little bit of everything in here because you have like that toxic vibe between the two of them, not just because they clearly have feelings for each other, but there's so much involved when it comes to Jude and her family life and just the fairy realm in general that brings like this kind of savage storyline to this entire book. Holly Black's stories definitely lean more towards like a dark fairy tale. So if that's something you kind of like out of your fantasy books, do not sleep on this series. I promise you, you will come back to this video and thank me later. If there's also another thing that I know about love, it's that you can't talk about toxic love without talking about vampires, and mostly A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, and another book that I have gone on and on and on about, but I can't explain to you like the romantic, gothic experience that this book will bring to you. But let's read the back of this one together so you can get a clear idea of what this story is about. Saved from the brink of death by a mysterious stranger, Constanta is transformed from a medieval peasant into a bride fit for an undying king. But when Dracula draws a cunning, aristocratic, and starving artist into his web of passion and deceit, Constanta realizes that her beloved is capable of terrible things. Finding comfort in the arms of her rival consorts, she begins to unravel their husband's dark secrets. With the lives of everyone she loves on the line, Constanta will have to choose between her own freedom and her love for her husband. But bonds forged by blood can be broken only by death. So you can tell just from the synopsis that this story is really just very dark, very deep, very romantic, but also very toxic. They live in this world that is kind of controlled by Dracula, and as time goes on, the entire family unit starts to realize that he is not all he's cracked up to be. These consorts have kept coming in to their family. Constanta has developed relationships with each and every one of them, and she starts to realize that for them to live a happier, eternal life, they might have to do that without Dracula being involved. I will say check trigger warnings on this book. It is definitely a dark story. So I would check those before reading it. But along with that, like the emotion and the romance that was behind this was just so atmospheric and like lush and delicious. Oh, I love this book so much. This was a 5-star read for me when I read it, and I kind of wish that I could read it for the first time again. Love S.T. Gibson. So I couldn't leave Dracula as the only toxic vampire on the list. I had to also include Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice, which I read this past fall. I had wanted to read this book for so long, and I am actually really glad that I did, but it is definitely a much slower pace than A Dowry of Blood. So I ended up getting, this is what they had, I think, at my bookstore when I went to look for it, and it's kind of like the, I don't know, mass market copy, so it's like teeny tiny, but it's actually quite dense. And I did really enjoy this book, but just giving you a little heads up, it's definitely a heavier read than some of the other books we've already mentioned in the fantasy category. But let's talk about the synopsis of this one. So here are the confessions of a vampire: hypnotic, shocking, and chillingly erotic. This is a novel of mesmerizing beauty and astonishing force, a story of danger and flight, of love and loss, of suspense and resolution, and of the extraordinary power of the senses. It is literally a book about a human interviewing a vampire named Lewis, who has been alive for centuries at this point in time, and kind of recounting his entire experience being an immortal vampire and all of the things that have happened by the time he is interviewing with this human. Another typical vampire storyline where Lewis forms kind of a little family unit with another vampire named Lestat, and from there they even end up creating a vampire child that becomes part of their family. And along with that, it's an incredibly toxic environment most of the time. Because they are alive for so long, the dynamic between groups of these vampires are always shifting, and people are kind of fighting for alpha dog, if you will. I don't know if that's the best way to say that, but pretty similar storyline in this one as well. And Lewis is kind of, even though he's a vampire, seems to be really hanging on to a lot of human emotion and human ways of thinking, while the other vampires in his life don't. But regardless, it is another book full of toxic love in a vampire family environment, and definitely recommend if you are looking for kind of, that toxic vibe for this Valentine's Day season. All right, friends, so moving on to our next genre, and that is the fiction genre and the largest genre that we have on our list today. And we are starting off with an oldie but a goodie, and one that I don't think I've talked about too much, but when I was kind of prepping for this video, I really took a step back and looked at my bookshelves and I was like, think, Lori Beth, like think deep, dig deep for this one. What's another kind of unhinged toxic love story that we all just seem to love? The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. If you have not read this book, I highly recommend it as a classic. It's not very long, and I think it actually flows very well, like the storyline of it, which I know classics are sometimes kind of up and down for people. It depends on who you are, whether you like them or not. But I think this is a very readable story for the time that it was written in. But anyways, for those of you that don't know what The Great Gatsby is about, this follows a main character in I think it's like the 1920s, 1930s, named Nick, who decides for the summer to rent a small cottage in between the villages of West and East Egg. And they're kind of like outside of New York City. So think almost like Hamptons-esque. Beachy vibes for the summer, quickly realizes that his next door neighbor is Jay Gatsby, like the richest man in town, and he lives across the river from his cousin Daisy. He also realizes that his cousin Daisy and Gatsby used to have feelings for each other. That Gatsby's only goal over the entire summer was to kind of get Daisy's attention and kind of reel her in with all the extravagance and all of the parties and all of the booze and all of the jazz. It is very much that type of story, like the jazz era story. The drinking, the parties, the people in this story are living without a care in the world, only they all have like very deep, dark secrets and kind of live miserable lives. Daisy herself is actually kind of a toxic person, and she has a very unhinged relationship with her own husband. And Gatsby also has his own issues, and he's trying to do everything in his power to get Daisy back in his grip. It's kind of a wild story. And again, very romantic story. I would say it kind of romanticizes some of these very toxic behaviors in people, but it is also very beautiful and kind of heartbreaking at the same time. So if you're looking for a book that doesn't necessarily give you like all the lovey-dovey, like happy ending romance vibes for Valentine's Day, this might be right up your alley. Oh, okay. Another book that I wish I heard people talking about more, because it was such a wild ride for me and kind of incredibly unhinged, and that is Perfume Pain by Anna Dorn. First of all, just look at the stunning cover of this book. Like, you can't tell me you would see that in a bookstore and not want to buy it based on the cover alone, but the synopsis of the story is really what sold me on it. Midless and freshly canceled, novelist Astrid Dahl finds herself back in Sapphic Scribes, the Zoom writers group she co-founded before she was published. A fate worse than death, it almost feels like nothing will get her righted again, not even her love of perfume. But she temporarily forgets all that by throwing herself into a few sexy distractions. First there's Ivy, a PhD student researching 1950s lesbian pulp fiction, and then Penelope, a nosy neighbor living off Urban Outfitters settlement money. When actress and influencer Kat Gold wants to adapt Astrid's previous novel for TV, Astrid finally has a chance to resurrect her waning career. The Patricia Highsmith, a blend of amphetamines, alcohol, and cigarettes that causes blackouts and a disturbing series of events. Astrid Dahl's bad behavior just got worse. So clearly you can tell just from the back of the book how wild this story actually is. And Astrid might be truly like one of the most unhinged female characters I've ever read in a story, and I absolutely devoured it. Not only is she just trying to get her life back in order, like her actual career life, she constantly gets distracted by love or the idea of sex and love, and she kind of just falls into all of these really toxic behaviors that she has worked really hard to try to put behind her, but she just kind of like slowly falls back down this slippery slope of bad behavior that she just can't seem to get control of. Also, as you heard, there is heavy use of drugs and alcohol in this book, so if that's something you don't love in your stories, might not be the book for you, but if that's something that doesn't necessarily bother you, this book is actually very humorous, very dark, and kind of messed up. But just such a fun, wild ride. And I absolutely recommend, if you love like an unhinged woman in your stories, look no further. Perfume Pain is probably one of the best books that I read last year. So we're going to take a turn here. We're still in the fiction genre, but this is a little bit of a different book, at least for me, that I read last year, but I did enjoy it overall, and that was Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck. And this is the first Jenny Erpenbeck I've ever read, because this is a translated novel. I don't know if all of her works are translated, but the story behind this one I just found so intriguing. The long-running affair between Katharina and Hans begins in East Berlin at the end of the 1980s. And as it takes its passionate, difficult course, the world of the socialist GDR collapses around them. As the Times literary supplement writes, the weight of history, the particular experiences of East and West, and the ways in which cultural and subjective memory shape individual identity have always been present in Erpenbeck's work. She knows that no one is all bad, no state all rotten, and she masterfully captures the existential bewilderment of this period between states and ideologies. So you can tell it's so much more than just a love story, right? Just a relationship. This was such a tumultuous time in history in this part of the world that it just added an extra layer or another element to the story that was happening in the book. But mainly what happens is the love story between Katharina and Hans. He is an older married man and she is a young graduate trying to find her way in the world amongst all of this political unrest that is happening. The relationship between them very quickly turns toxic because Hans is very manipulative and kind of just writes the narrative for how he wants Katharina to act and like what life is going to be like for him. You know, the whole, yes, I'm going to leave my wife one day for you, but then he just keeps not doing it. But it was kind of interesting to watch Katharina go through all of these trials and tribulations, being that young and impressionable and having like an older person that you love, or at least you think you love, or that's your idea of love, and how they kind of control your life, and watching her get through that. It was a little hard to read at times, I'm not going to lie. And this is another slower, denser book. But at the end of the story, I found it to be quite beautiful, mostly because you're watching like this young woman truly develop over time. But not only is the love in this book kind of toxic, the environment that they live in is toxic as well. So if you like a little historical aspect to your stories, this was very beautifully written. I would really enjoy reading more from her someday. So hopefully I can find more translated novels. Couldn't do an unhinged Valentine's Day book recommendations list without a Sally Rooney. And I kind of had a hard time picking which Sally Rooney I wanted to put in this book, but I chose Beautiful World, Where Are You? Mostly because I liked the dynamic in this one because it involved so many characters. So in this story, we follow Alice, a novelist, who meets Felix, who works in a warehouse, and asks him if he'd like to travel to Rome with her. In Dublin, her best friend Eileen is getting over a breakup and slips back into flirting with Simon, a man she has known since childhood. Alice, Felix, Eileen, and Simon are still young, but life is catching up with them. They desire each other, they delude each other, they get together, they break apart, they have sex, they worry about their friendships and the world they live in. Are they standing in the last lighted room before the darkness, bearing witness to something? Will they find a way to believe in a beautiful world? So that's a little bit of a twofer, if you will, with this book, because not only do you get two relationships, so two female characters in this book trying to kind of test the waters and develop relationships with these men. You have the relationship between Alice and Eileen, the two best friends, as well. Typical to Sally Rooney fashion, it's kind of a little morally gray. Also, like, you don't know if you really love the characters, if you really hate that. Like, you can't really gauge how you feel about them the whole time, but somehow she just writes human and human behavior so well that it just sucks you in, and you just want to see where the story is going to go. Like, what is going to happen to these two relationships with these friends, all of them together? Like, where is it going to land? Like, what is going to happen to them? Within the dynamic of like all of these characters, there's a lot of behavior that you might not consider healthy, especially with the friends. You know, sometimes you are an instigator for a friend because you just love and care about them so much. Sometimes you're a little harsh and a little too real with them because they are your best friend. And then also just kind of what you'll put up with in a relationship and learning and growing from that over time. Not all of Sally Rooney's books are like happy ending, happy-go-lucky. This one I felt ended in a way that just left me like very pleasant. Like I felt good about the way it ended. But I loved the dynamic of this one because there are so many characters. And if you want to read about love in a few different forms in one story, this is absolutely top-notch. I mean, I love Sally Rooney, but I really do think it's top-notch. All right. Landing on our very last fiction novel of the video, and that is The Pisces by Melissa Broder, and talk about a completely unhinged woman. This is a absolutely crazy story. I'm not gonna lie, I have feelings about this book. I have some mixed feelings about this book. I did overall enjoy it because I really like Melissa Broder's writing, but because the character in this book is so unhinged, she was a little hard to read at times, full disclosure. But let's go over the synopsis of this one. Lucy has been writing her dissertation on Sappho for 9 years when she and her boyfriend break up in a dramatic flameout. After she bottoms out in Phoenix, her sister in LA insists Lucy dog sit for the summer in her gorgeous Venice Beach home. And when Lucy becomes entranced by an eerily attractive swimmer while sitting alone on the beach one night, her life, including her understanding of what love should look like, takes a very unexpected turn. A masterful blend of vivid realism and giddy fantasy, pairing hilarious frankness with pulse-racing eroticism, The Pisces is a story about falling in obsessive love with a merman, a figure of serenic fantasy whose very existence pushes Lucy to question everything she thought she knew about love, lust, and meaning in the one life we have. I mean, you can hear that the book is kind of bizarre. It's a little bizarro. And again, I enjoyed most of it, but some of it was a little hard to read. So I might check trigger warnings on this book just in case. But typical to Melissa Broder's writing style, it kind of gives you that blend of magical realism, like fantasy-ish, with real life. But mostly it's a story about this woman who just kind of spends most of her life like thinking about love and letting love control everything around her. And as she's going through this breakup, she just very quickly becomes obsessive over a different type of love. A story about a woman that just continuously falls back into toxic patterns, bad behaviors, things that are getting her further from really where she needs to be in her life. It was a wild ride. So don't necessarily think this book is going to be for everyone, but if you like your books a little weird and like a little dirty, this might be like a hidden gem for you that you haven't read yet. So I don't know, give this one a go. All right, moving on to our next genre, and a really small genre. I'm kind of blending two books into one genre here, and we're gonna call this the like thriller horror genre, just because I don't want to separate them really. Is it? But starting off with one that, again, as I was standing back from my bookshelves, I was like, oh, that might be a good one to talk about, like a shitty relationship. And that is Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. I don't talk about thrillers a lot, and I do read them. I enjoy thrillers, but I have also stated that I don't read them that frequently because I can find them to be kind of repetitive. And because I enjoy them, I like to just spread them out a little bit. You know, I don't need the thriller storyline all the time. Just a little taste every now and then. But this one I really enjoyed, and I think it's because it was such an atmospheric book. So in this story, we follow a couple who has a marriage that is kind of on the rocks, and somehow one of them ends up winning a trip to a cottage in Scotland. They think it's the perfect opportunity to get away, just like spend some time as a couple and reconnect over the weekend in this kind of like secluded cottage in the middle of nowhere, because nothing would ever go wrong in that scenario. And of course, as soon as they get there, everything is dark, everything is snow covered, and creepy things kind of start happening. So as they spend the weekend in this house, They're hearing things, lights are going out, things are making noise, and they continuously feel on edge with each other. And they kind of start to unravel at the seams, and all of these secrets and things start to come out of the woodwork. So not only was it just a perfectly atmospheric book, you're talking like a cottage in Scotland in winter, like the dead of winter, snow-covered, like that quiet sound that you get from just like a couple of feet of snow, or maybe you don't. Where I live, I know what that sounds like. But you already had this couple that was kind of falling apart, and they just slowly start to get worse and worse as the weekend goes on. Like, I didn't see the reveal coming, and I loved it. I thought it was twisty-turny, loved the plot, loved the vibes, loved that the base of the story was about a couple that was kind of falling apart. So if you like thrillers and you want a little bit of like dark, twisty love, this is a really good story to read for that cozy Valentine's Day weekend. And next up in our thriller/horror genre is Monstrilio by Gerardo Samano Cordova. And again, another cover that I just die over every time I see it. I think it's absolutely stunning. It's like the one that you kind of just like, the more you look at it, the more it just somehow stands out to you. But what a crazy book this was. So in this story, we follow a couple who lose their child. Their son ends up passing away, and they are absolutely devastated, like beyond grief for this family. The mom remembers like this old wives' tale, I guess you could call it, where you can keep a piece of a person that has passed away and try to regrow it, like nurture it over time and create that person from a piece of them after they've passed away. So she takes a small piece of her son's lung and kind of starts taking care of it and feeding it until it starts to grow into the sentient being, like this little monster. And over time, it just continues to become more and more human. But this little monster definitely isn't the same child that they lost. Like, it is its own being with its own personality and its own habits. And it kind of causes strife within the entire family. So not just the husband and the wife, but the grandparents and friends of the family, and of course, this monster himself. So this one discusses love in a much different form because it is more of like a family setting. But of course, as we know, some of the most toxic kind of love can come from a family. And that's what this story is kind of about. It's kind of a profound story. You're talking about such a deep love. When it's a piece of you, it's, even though it was like a piece of their son, it was still a piece of their son that came from both of them. Instigating behaviors in someone like your spouse, or when do you put your foot down and draw the line? When is something too much? When does something bring a family together? What can break a family apart? And I will say, check trigger warnings on this book as well. There are some kind of dark things that it gets into as the story unfolds. But overall, it's just like a story about family and a story about love and what love can do within a family. It was very gripping. I don't read a lot of horror, but this one has kind of like stuck with me, but like in a good way. And even though it was kind of creepy and dark at times, the fact that it was discussing grief in so many ways and love in so many ways, I just found absolutely gripping. And it was kind of a page-turning book. So I really, really recommend, if you like a horror book with a little bit of family love in there, a little sprinkle of family love, check out Monstrilio. So we have made it to the end of our list in our very last genre, which is the romance genre. But I did not want to pick a romance that was warm and fuzzy and that would leave you feeling like a princess in a fairy tale at the end of it. So what was my option then? Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings. This is quite literally a book about a toxic relationship. That is the whole premise of this story. And let me tell you, I ate this up. I devoured it like it was some kind of drug. I have already stated that. I don't know what kind of drugs this woman puts in her books, but it's working. It's working for me. I can't wait to continue on with this series. But let's read the synopsis of this one before I just start rambling on for too long. Magnolia Parks is a beautiful, affluent, self-involved, and mildly neurotic London socialite. BJ Valentine is Britain's most notorious and photographed bad boy who broke her heart. But these two are meant to be, and everyone knows it. Magnolia and BJ are written in the stars, just suspended in a strange kind of love that looks like hurting each other a lot of the time. She dates other people to keep him at bay. he sleeps with other girls to get back at her for it. But at the end of their every sad endeavor to get over one another, it's still each other they crawl back to. Finally, after years of this, their dysfunction is catching up with them, pulling at their seams and fraying the world they've built. But they're not ready to let go. Not yet, at least. As the cracks start to show and secrets begin to surface, Magnolia and BJ are forced to face the formidable question they've been avoiding all their lives. How many loves do you really get in a lifetime? So I did talk about this book in my most recent wrap-up, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, and a lot of people probably already know what this book is about, but I'll link my video here in case you want to go back and get a more in-depth description of the synopsis. But basically, we're following the rich of the rich in London, like high-level socialites, people with so much money, you and I can't even begin to imagine what that life is like. And they are just so dysfunctional. He cheats on her. She has all these fake boyfriends to make him jealous. They have all these friend groups. They text each other. Things get miscommunicated. So if you don't love miscommunication, book is not for you. But it's just a whole vicious circle that they find themselves in because they have broken trust with each other, but they love each other so deeply that they can't let each other go. And man, I'm telling you what, it is like reading a reality TV show, just like on paper. Absolutely phenomenal. So if you were actually looking for a romance book for Valentine's Day this year, but you wanted it to be a little bit more like Vanderpump Rules, look no further because this is gold. Well, there you have it, my friends. Those are all of my book recommendations for you for this Valentine's Day, because who wants cute and cozy when you can have unhinged, dysfunctional, and downright toxic? Isn't that so much more fun? As always, I would love to know if you have read any of the books that we talked about in today's video. What are your thoughts and opinions on those books? Or do you have a book recommendation that might fall into that toxic vibe that I'm trying to bring this Valentine's Day? Drop that in a comment down below. I would also like to thank Novelwicks Candles for partnering with me on today's video one more time, and don't forget that you can use my code Lori10 to get a discount on anything that she has in the shop. As always, if you liked this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button because it always helps a girl out. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any of my other upcoming videos, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. And of course, it has been an absolute blast, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next one.